Hello, my name is Justin Shaw, and I'm going to be recording a video on shading. In our last video, we went over several other steps on how to draw the shapes, build them. Right now I'm going to explain the basics of shading. Shading is taking light and making an object reflected in real life. Now, the world's set up so that you can understand things. Like, let's take this cube. A cube, because it all has flat faces, every face, when it reaches a hard edge, will be darker than the last. I'm just going to put a default gray on top of all of it. Now your brain knows that as the light hits, it hits one face that's directly towards it. So if I have a face, well, put it on another layer. If I have an object and I have a light bulb, wherever the light hits first is going to be the brightest. And as the light gets to the edges, this area is going to be lit. And right here, you're going to get a dark spot. This is the darkest spot because as light hits here, it gets bright, then the light doesn't hit it anymore. This is called the core shadow, or the terminal. And it lights up back here because as the light goes past it, it bounces back and hits it. Backlight. Now, to show that an object is three-dimensional, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say that every object needs to have a light, a medium, and a dark. I'm going to say that this side is the dark side, or the light side, and what I need to do is create a medium and a dark side. Now you can do this with paper very easily. I use Photoshop because it's easier for me to record. See, and this cube is finished. It has light hitting it, the next lightest surface, the darkest. Now, as I hit a cube, any objects, any edges, I add a little bit of white to the edge because wherever the lightest edge is will meet the darkest edge. It's a phenomena that we know about but don't fully understand. Let's see. Now, on this cube needs to be shaded, and so I'm going to say that the light source comes this way, the light goes this direction, and it's going to cast a shadow. So if I imagine a light bulb and a ball, the cast shadow will be the light straight lines to the edge. So I will get this for my shadow. I'm going to do the same thing with this box. I'm just going to find the edges. I know there's a line right there. So I'm going to go here to here. And that gives me my shadow. And I know that my shadow gets darker as it gets closer to the object. This is called ambient occlusion. When two objects get near each other, it'll actually happen all the way around the object a little bit. Then there's another thing I know about my shadow. The further an object gets away, the more blurred, more light starts to get in and starts affecting the shadow. This is how to shade a cube. Now that we've got the cube, we're going to go into the cylinder. Cylinder has a very similar setup. I like to start with gray because it lets me go to black and it lets me go to white. If I start with on a white sheet of paper with a white outline, then all I can do is go to dark. But if I start on gray, that means I shade the paper a little bit. Start with a middle gray. Then what I'm going to do is curved structures are just a little bit different. This hard edge, if you see this piece on top, your brain to tell you that there's a hard edge somewhere, the light reacts differently. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say that the top has to be a different shade than the bottom. So I'm just going to duplicate that just to make the side a little brighter or darker, because that's how I tell the difference between the top and the bottom, the hard edge. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start shading. And I'm going to say the light is coming this way, hitting my object. I'm going to say that it starts here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap my lines around. This is what I do if I've got a pencil. If you draw a straight line, you flatten the object out. I want to wrap it around the surface like this. And I'm going to do some on the other side as well. I'm going to do the same thing with the highlight. Now this is called the specular highlight. And the more fine you make it, the more glossy, because a diffuse specular will look like this. See, you can barely really tell where it's at. But if I want to make it super glossy, what I can do is I can tighten up that highlight. And now I've got a smooth material. And I do the same thing with the backlight. But that's not what we're working on. We're just trying to shade this to be a real shape. Add a little more highlight. I do not suggest that you use Photoshop, especially if you're just learning, because all of these things, they work whether you're using Photoshop or not, because I learned without Photoshop. Adding that line where the dark and light meet, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that there's light that bounces past the object and hits the back. And I want to make sure that that's about this tone, the middle tone. Just a little bit backlight, curve it around. And it's more intense towards the ground because it's closer to being hit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say that this object now needs to cast a shadow. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the shape of the object from the bottom. I'm going to make it curve because the top is curved. Darken it, or reduce the opacity. Blur the edges as it gets towards the end. And I'm going to darken it as it gets closer to the object for ambient occlusion. As two objects get closer to each other, less light can get in here. And so it gets darker just because the bounce light can't move in there very well. And then I just blur this. Put a little bit of ambient occlusion around the base of the object. Mush all these layers together. Give them a quick once over. That's two down. Scoot you a little bit that way. And just shoe back. Now we're going to go to the cone. As we talked about before, dotted lines up, connect it. As I do with everything, I like to start with gray, and if you can, there's gray paper that they sell at places like Hobby Lobby or Home Depot. Well, and you can get it and get some chalk, and if you're at Hobby Lobby you can get chalk, and you can also get what's called vine charcoal. Vine charcoal is a jet black substance. It's very nice to shade with. I'm going to figure out where my light's coming from. I'm going to pick a place that's near the viewer, not directly at me, but what it does is when light hits, it gets thicker at the bottom. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that where's the shadow hit? I'm going to say that it's the opposite side. I'm just going to put some dark on this side, dark on this side. wrap my form around. Filter, blur this. I'm going to tighten it up just a little bit. Add in that core shadow. Now I'm going to go through and I'm going to add the cast shadow. Just going to grab the edges. I know the end has a point. Connect it. Fill it in. Blur the furthest point. Add ambient occlusion. I want to warp that cone down some more. Distort. Oh. Put it there. Put too much on one layer. Alright, there's the cone. Now we've got the last piece is the sphere. Now the sphere is a soft edge, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a point, and I'm going to say right here is my specular area. I'm going to get a little more specular. Filter, blur. Now, if I know where the light is, then I can say that this is where the terminal is, where the light no longer hits and it gets to be its darkest. I always go around the other side a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag this around. You should spend your time just shading these. You don't need a shading tool. You should just draw them and draw soft enough that you can erase. It's very frustrating if you're pressing too hard to have to erase over and over again. Now I'm going to add in my backlight. And I don't want my backlight, unless I want something metal, to be as bright as this. I want it to be this mid-tone shade. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go for a shadow. Grabbed a little too much. Add in my ambient occlusion. Zoom back. Now we've got the sphere. Now we have all four shapes shaded. Now leaving the black outlines on them is a bad thing. It makes them look less real, because if I remove them, you'd see pretty quickly that they become a lot more natural. it unflattens. See how flat this edge is and how flat this one is? You don't want outlines on your objects. So as you go back through, I want to get rid of the dark outlines. If this was shading, next time we'll be going into perspective and understanding how to use these shapes to create more complicated objects.